Hello! Well, this is the big one, isn't it? Something that I've been looking forward to, well, since episode 100 was uploaded to the channel a little over 2 years ago. Episode 200 of Zilog and Moto. That's right, it's the big 200 numbered episodes uploaded to the channel, covering a total of 204 games for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. When I look back and think about how much time I've spent putting together these videos for the last 4.5 years, it's a lot. There's been a lot of hours of capturing game footage, and then all the time I played these games, and then didn't have the record button pressed for when the capture was lost because my PC crashed. We don't like to talk about that. The time spent writing each of these review scripts that average 4,000 words, time researching all the historical and technical facts about the games. By the way, Sega Retro and Moby games are invaluable resources for these reviews. I wouldn't have been able to do all this writing without them, and boy, I hope they stay online for years to come, or else this job is going to be a lot more difficult. And then of course there's all the time taken to record video and voiceovers before finally cobbling everything together in Power Director. It's definitely taken a large chunk out of my free time. But honestly, I'm really glad that I've gone down this path and put in the work. I've experienced a lot of games that I probably never would have otherwise, that would have just been lost to time, but more importantly, it's opened up opportunities and introduced me to some truly great people that I never would have experienced or met otherwise. And I'm sure that there's some people out there that are gonna look at my numbers and scoff from the outside and say things like, "You've been doing this for 4.5 years and you still only have 526 subscribers. Clearly you're doing something wrong," or something negative like that. But instead, I'm humbled that there are 526 of you out there that have liked what I'm doing enough to want to know when I upload new videos, and that's pretty damn cool. I don't need to be Metal Jesus Rocks or John Riggs or Pat the NES Punk. I just want to talk about video games. So let's do that. Enough of this serious talk. Let's get into the point of this week's video, and that is a game that is usually at least in the conversation when you talk about the best games ever released for the Genesis. And that game is the sequel to the game that I reviewed back in episode 100, Sonic 2. Now, some of you might be wondering why I'm reviewing Sonic 2 rather than Sonic the Hedgehog for the Master System, and the short answer is simply because I wanted to, but also if you're not aware, the Sonic games on the Master System aren't direct ports of the Genesis titles, so I thought it would make more sense to do the Genesis games first and then swing back to the Master System games later. Sonic 2 is a game that I wouldn't have wanted to be on the development staff for. I mean, can you imagine the pressure? You're having to create a game that is the sequel to the title that literally put Sega on the map in the United States, with a character that came out of nowhere to become beloved all over the world. And oh, by the way, Sega was scheduling Sonic 2 for a Christmas 1992 release, meaning that if Sonic 2 wasn't a massive holiday hit, Nintendo would be able to make up some serious ground with the Super Nintendo. So, was Sonic Team able to deliver Christmas for Sega in the form of Sonic 2? Or is Sonic 2 more along the lines of been there, done that? Well, I think we all know the answer to that question, but just humor me and let me do the review anyway. And having said that, let's start with a look at the package. And this is my copy of Sonic 2, or technically I should say Sonic the Hedgehog 2, as it states on the cover. This copy is in decent shape, definitely not perfect, but it's good enough for me, and the manual has some interesting quirks that I'll get to in a minute. The hang tab has been removed from the top of the case, but other than that it's held up pretty well, with no scuffing or scratching to the outside cover, and the inner cover looks great, with no edge wear, water damage, or sun bleaching. Looking at the cover, you can probably see why I refer to this game as Sonic 2. I mean, in reality, it's just because I'm lazy, but you can also see how much of an emphasis that Sega put on the 2 portion of the title, with Robotnik in the background gripping the giant 2, and then also in the actual logo, where the 2 is the largest part of the logo down at the bottom, and the Hedgehog portion is clearly not emphasized, with it given a different and smaller font than the rest of the title. To me, this is an iconic cover, not just for the art that was used, but also for the background. If you notice, the background used on the cover of Sonic 2 is unique and is not the standard black cross hatching that Sega utilized pre-1993. Instead, it's a gray and black checkerboard style, clearly meant to emulate the look of the Green Hill Zone background. I think it's a great choice, and if there was a game where Sega was going to go outside the box with their formatting a bit, this was the title to do it. In a change from the original Sonic the Hedgehog, the European cover of the game uses the same art as the US cover, but it still utilizes the classic black formatting that the other titles used at the time, so if you were curious about what Sonic 2 would look like had Sega not used that checkerboard background in the US, well, here you go. As far as Japan goes though, they again got a very different looking cover to their version of Sonic 2, just like how the original Sonic the Hedgehog looked very different in Japan. In this case, I think the US definitely got the best cover, but I could definitely see why someone might prefer that European formatting. Flipping over to the back, and there's a traditional Sega layout from the time period with the tagline at the top, emphasizing the fact that Sonic 2 was now a two-player game. Well, kind of, anyway, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. However, if you had questions about who the orange fox is on the cover, well, now you know. It's Tails. Maybe. In yet another confusing decision from when Sega of America and Sega of Japan couldn't seem to figure out that they were on the same side, if you look down at the last screenshot, it shows Tails in the bonus stage with Sonic, but there he is referred to as Miles. Well, it turns out it's because they slipped up and used a screenshot from the Japanese version, so that's why it doesn't quite line up with the tagline at the top. I'll go into all this more later, don't worry. Opening up the package, the manual has definitely seen better days, and you may have noticed that the cartridge is actually a not-for-resale version, but not the more commonly seen Yellow Star not-for-resale version. I should probably fix this at some point so that the cover matches the cartridge, but that's a problem for another day. As far as the manual goes, it's pretty great, and definitely in line with what Sega was producing at the time. It explains all the confusion about Miles vs. Tails, and also has tons of pictures to go along with explaining the game, and has a section that I always love to see in these manuals, and that's where it details the enemies that you run into, but not just that, there's also the inclusion of some great concept artwork for each of them. One last thing, the previous owner wrote down some of the codes for the game in the manual, and then even taped a printed description of how to get to the debug menu on top of the World Delusion ad on the back. On the one hand, I'd like to get a clean copy of the manual, but I do like the ingenuity shown of keeping up with that code. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see if Sonic Team was able to pull off a sequel that was better than an all-time great game. Wow, so where do I start with this one? Sonic 2 is a game that I put a lot of time into back in the day. I can't remember how I ended up with a copy of it. Maybe it was a Christmas present in 1992 like it was for so other many people that year. But either way, it was a game that I played enough to beat it honestly, and even collect all 7 of the Chaos Emeralds to get the good ending. But that was 30 years ago, and I hadn't played it again until this week when working on this review. While I remembered certain things about the game, for instance the half-pipe based special stages that were wildly different from the special stages in the original Sonic the Hedgehog, and figuring out where to hit Metal Sonic to defeat him, I felt like a genius at the time. But other than that, most of the rest of the game I had totally forgotten. I did remember that most of the zones in Sonic 2 consisted of 2 stages rather than 3, like in the original, but what was actually in those stages? My 43-year-old brain was drawing a complete blank. So while playing Sonic 2 this week wasn't a completely new experience, it was one where I was able to fully enjoy rediscovering the game, shall we say. Briefly, from a historical perspective, the original Sonic the Hedgehog made its debut in June of 1991. A few months later, in August of that year, Nintendo would release the Super Nintendo in the United States, and with it introduce the juggernaut that is Super Mario World to the Western world. While, yes, technically Super Mario World predates the original Sonic the Hedgehog, from an American perspective, Super Mario World was seen as a huge counteroffensive to the wildly popular Sonic, and Sega now needed to respond in kind. But what could they do? How could they improve on what was already a fantastic game, and if you remember my review from episode 100, a game that I gave 4 stars to? Well, one of the largest changes to the game was to make it 2-player. The Mario Bros. Series had famously been a two-player game since its inception with the original Mario Bros. In 1983. So it made sense for Sega to take advantage of that second controller that many gamers had hooked up, just waiting to be used. However, Mario Bros. Had always had two characters to choose from if someone wanted to play a two-player game, with at least Mario and Luigi always being there to represent the player. Sega only had Sonic from that first game, so they needed another character to fill out the roster, to avoid doing something lame like having two players control Sonic. And yes, any other game that is two players but have both players play the same character, that's lame and uncreative. At very least, have two characters that are palette swaps like Billy and Jimmy Lee or Bill and Lance from Contra. And yes, releasing the same game with three different names is lame too, but we don't have time for that Contra, Grisor, Probotector rabbit hole right now. Anyway, Sonic Team went to the drawing board and came back with Miles Prower, a young orange fox. You see, his name is Miles Prower, which sounds like miles per hour because he's fast, and you get the idea. Now, personally, I thought that was a great name, and even as a kid, I thought the pun in his name was amusing. However, Sega of America apparently didn't love it so much, and instead wanted to call Miles Tails because of his two tails. I'm not sure why Sega wanted to call attention to the David Cronenberg-esque body horror of Fox having two tails, but I guess it tested well with the kids or something. Anyway, the compromise would be for Tails to serve as Miles' nickname, and the character was referred to interchangeably as Miles in Japan and Tails in the United States. Hence the note I made earlier about the screenshot being from the Japanese version of the game on the back of the box. Now, with a second character created, Sega could implement two-player functionality in-game. But what was the best way to do that? In the Mario Bros. Series, except for the original arcade game, two-player mode always meant taking turns. First player would play a level as Mario, and then the second player would play a level as Luigi, and so on and so forth. And while that alternating style of play isn't bad necessarily, it is a little less exciting than when two players can actually play together at the same time. Sonic Team thought about that and came up with two answers. The first idea was to have the first player be the main character with the screen focused on Sonic, but then have the second player be able to control Tails, who otherwise would automatically be handled by the computer if playing in Sonic and Tails mode. And while that's interesting for boss fights and the special stages, it doesn't really result in a game that's two players simultaneous at all times. So Sonic Team came up with a second two-player mode, but this time it was more of a competition, with Sonic and Tails having their own halves of the screen to navigate through the levels and compete for rings and time. This was pulled off by Sonic 2 having a pretty unique feature on the Genesis of running in 480 interlace mode as opposed to its standard graphics mode of 240 progressive. This alternate graphics mode can result in some odd display issues like flickering, which is part of why the only other Genesis game to try it was the two-player mode of Combat Cars. But it's an ingenuitive solution to having both players still be able to see their full viewable area while fitting it into only half the screen. Sonic Team didn't start there with updating Sonic 2 in an attempt to give players a new experience. I mentioned earlier that Sonic 2 now had new bonus stages. One of the frequent complaints about the original Sonic the Hedgehog is the bonus stages, when you try to collect the Chaos Emeralds. I personally didn't have a problem with them, and didn't think they were necessarily that frustrating, but many people didn't like the spinning nature of the levels. To change things up a bit, in Sonic 2, the third dimension has now been brought into the mix. The bonus stages now consist of watching Sonic, and Tails if playing with both characters, in a third-person view, as Sonic now has to travel an undulating half-pipe going up and down both sides to collect a certain amount of rings, while avoiding bombs in the track. Even though I didn't mind the original bonus stages, I do like these stages a bit better, as they're somewhat less chaotic, which I guess betrays the name Chaos Emeralds a bit, but it does make the challenge of the levels more tolerable, as you can memorize the patterns of the rings and bombs after a number of runs down the courses. Also, Sega changed how you get to the bonus stages in Sonic 2, and this is another improvement in my opinion. In the original Sonic the Hedgehog, to get to a bonus stage, you had to finish a non-boss level with over 50 rings, giving you, at best, 12 chances to accumulate the 6 emeralds in that game. However, as the levels get more difficult, it becomes much harder to even get to the bonus stage, meaning that failure to get an emerald in one of the earlier levels can be potentially crushing. In Sonic 2, you can now enter a bonus stage at any lamppost in the level, assuming you have 50 rings, meaning that it's technically possible to get all of the emeralds in the first zone. Sega included a 7th emerald in Sonic 2 to balance that out a bit, and even with the extra opportunities, I still would not call it easy to collect them all. Rather, it feels like a very appropriate level of challenge. Also, pro tip, if you're not playing with a second player controlling Tails, it's recommended to play the game fully in single player mode, because otherwise, the number of rings that you have to collect to pass these bonus stages goes up, and without fail, Tails is going to eat a bomb and probably lose rings that you needed to pass the level. I mentioned earlier that the zone design of Sonic 2 was slightly different than the original game. In Sonic 2, most of the main zones consist of 2 levels rather than 3. At first, that makes it seem like the game has been downsized a bit, but in reality, the game remains about the same length. The first game features 6 zones of 3 acts apiece, and then the final zone for a total of 19 levels. Sonic 2 features 8 full zones, with all but 1 having 2 acts, and Metropolis Zone having 3, and then 3 additional 1-act zones for a total of 20 levels. Doing it this manner just gives the game a much bigger feel, even though it really only has 1 more level, due to just how varied each of the different zones are. And sure, there's places where you can say, oh, Emerald Hill is just Green Hill renamed, or Chemical Plant Zone is just a redo of Starlight Zone, or even Metropolis Zone is just a slightly less dangerous version of Scrap Bearing Zone. And you wouldn't be wrong, the game definitely shares some similarities and concepts with the original game, down to reusing some of these original sound effects. But I think there was also a concerted effort to make the game similar to the original to appeal to all the existing fans, but also expand upon that blueprint and adding enough things to make this truly feel like its own game, even if you were to ignore Tails and the game's 2-player aspect. One of the ways in which the game changed the least from the original is its control scheme. If you're familiar with the original, you'll be able to immediately pick up and play this game, as it still utilizes the same single button control scheme, and all of the power-ups in the game, at least in the single player mode, are exactly the same as they were previously. However, I'm okay with this, because one of the ways in which the original Sonic the Hedgehog succeeded was with how well it played, and Sonic 2 has the same tight and responsive gameplay, where you're never fighting the controller to get Sonic or Tails to do what you want them to do. And they didn't totally leave the controls alone, because there is one new feature, the addition of a spin dash where you can go from 0 to 60 immediately. This is a fantastic and yet still incredibly simple addition to gameplay that fits right in and makes you wonder how it wasn't included in the original game. To be fair, the levels in the first game had less inclines in their design, so you could get by without it, but it still would have been great to have. Graphically, Sonic 2 is a sight to behold 30 years plus later. If you followed my channel for any length of time, you've probably heard me lament the Genesis simultaneous 64 color on-screen limitation. But if you didn't know about that limitation and the only Genesis game you knew was Sonic 2, you'd probably swear it could display more. All of the visuals in the game, the sprites, the backgrounds, the parallax scrolling, it is all incredibly detailed. I don't want to get into a too direct comparison with Super Mario World, but honestly, for the most part, other than a few Super Nintendo special effects here and there, Sonic 2 looks far better than Super Mario World. And if you don't believe me, go run through Yoshi's Island real quick and notice just how bland the backgrounds and characters look in comparison. And I love Super Mario World. I think it's one of the best games of all time, but that's just how good Sonic 2 looks when you put them up against one another. From a sound perspective, I don't know that I would say the audio is as good as the graphics, but it's pretty great in its own right. It does lose a few points for the aforementioned reuse of sound effects and themes like the Invincibility theme, but other than that, the in-game music is fantastic. Each level has a track that perfectly fits the theme of the level, for instance the loungy Vegas-ish music of the Casino Night Zone, or the spooky, funky style of Mystic Cave Zone. The game also makes up great use of the stereo sound capabilities of the Genesis, so you'll definitely want to crank this one up with 2 speakers. As frustrated as I might have gotten later on in the game in some of the trickier areas, the music was always there to get my head right back into it and get back into the game. It's not the best soundtrack that I've heard on the Genesis so far in the last 200 episodes. That would probably go to Streets of Rage, but this one is definitely up there with games like Decap Attack, Sword of Vermilion, and Gauntlet 4. There's just no other way to say it. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 needed to deliver for Sega in the 1992 Christmas season, and despite any weirdness between Sega of Japan and Sega of America at the time, Sonic 2 hit a walk-off grand slam. Now, granted, if for some reason, if you didn't like the original Sonic the Hedgehog, I don't think this game's going to win you over, because it doesn't do much that's different from the original formula. It just happens to do everything better than before, which is a good thing. As a result, and for improving on a game that I already rated as being worth 4 stars, I'm finally getting around to using this graphic that I created 4.5 years ago when I started the channel, and making Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Genesis the first game in Zilog and Moto history to be awarded 5 stars. I'm not in a position to say it's the best Genesis game ever, because I still have tons and tons of games to play in my journey through the library, but it's very definitely near the top, and something any Sega fan should have in their collection. Okay, and that was Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Genesis. Now, I'm sure there's probably some people out there that aren't going to agree with this review. And that's fine. I'm sure that you could probably say the same thing about each and every review that I've done thus far. If nothing else is clear about Zilog and Moto, these are all my personal opinions and not anyone else. And I'm not here telling you what to think for yourself, I'm just telling you what I think. This one was a fun one for me though, not just because I enjoy the game, clearly I do, but I kind of had in the back of my head that this could potentially be the first 5-star game on the channel when I reviewed the original Sonic 100 episodes ago, but I hadn't played through it in 30 years, so I didn't know for sure. There was still some mystery there. Is this the best Genesis game of all time? Is it the only 5-star game that I'll review for the channel? Well, I can't say as I don't have a crystal ball, but we'll just have to see. I do think that there's at least 2 others that have a chance though, but I won't be spoiling that just yet. Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, it's the game that I've been mentioning during these end of video segments for what seems like a month now. Winter Olympics for the Master System. Yes, it finally made it across the ocean, and thankfully intact as it was just sent in a mailer instead of a box. I've got to be honest, I'm really just happy to fill in the missing slot in the collection. I'm not actually looking forward to playing the game, because you may remember that despite its 16 megabit size, the Genesis version started out Season 3 on the channel with a resounding thud and is one of the worst games that I've reviewed so far on the channel. Fingers crossed that the Master System version does, well, anything better than that version. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 200. Man, it feels good to say that. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.